All right, at this point, we've gotten the United States into the war with Pearl Harbor, and we talked a little bit about the Pacific Theater as the United States starts to move westward towards Japan. Well, obviously, at the same time, Germany had declared war on the United States. The United States can now openly, since we're in a war, can openly support our allies and can join the allies who are fighting against Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. And so one of the first ways that we start to see the tide turning is actually with our allies to the east in the eastern side of the European theater, which is the Soviet Union. And remember, they're poorly trained and poorly equipped and that sort of stuff. God love them, they had a ton of people. We talked about Leningrad and how at Barbarossa, the Nazis had tried to come in and take over, and it had failed, even though they had killed a whole bunch of people through starvation and stuff, and Hitler had lost a lot of people in his army. Well, the same thing happens again. Battle of Stalingrad is in August of '42. Nazis start to super bomb the city and things like that. Devastation, as you can see in the top picture here. But then once again, they're unable to finish them off. Winter sets in, and the German troops actually get trapped without supplies. And when I say trapped without supplies, the weather makes it impossible for them to move out. And the Germans actually have to end up surrendering to the Soviets. And then, then you go forward in time. Well, this protecting the motherland, or the motherland calls, I think is the name of the statue, is amazing. The name of the city now is Volgograd, which is the original name. The Soviets had changed, the communists changed the names of things to, this was paying homage to Stalin, their leader at the time. But that's an amazing, impressive statue. This is right on the Volga River. For those of you curious, this is actually where caviar comes from originally. So the Germans are dealt a defeat, and then the United States is in the war. So we're going to do something that might seem strange. The French, especially de Gaulle, wanted us to immediately jump in to help the British to try to jump right into invading Western Europe in France and liberate France. Well, the United States is going to have none of that. We actually, it seems strangely enough, we actually started in Africa. In '42, our troops move into the northern part of Africa and move across the northern coast of Africa, and there's Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia, towards Egypt. We actually run the Germans out of Africa and secure those oil pipelines and places like that, and the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean here to the Red Sea, and then towards the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And we are now prepared that we've controlled North Africa to move over into Italy and to try to take out one of Hitler's partners, which of course is Mussolini in Italy. Now, the Italians did not have the military that the Germans did. And what we're really trying to do is come in on the south side. This is France over here, as you can see, Yugoslavia, and Germany's up here to the north, that we're really going to try to open a new front to make them kind of draw their attention away from where they were going to go. So as you see, this is September of '43, move into this is Sicily first, and there's sort of like a battle as we start to roll up mostly Italian forces and those groups, but some Germans as well, and then move on to mainland Italy, land at Salerno, and start to push up towards Rome. Well, at this point, the Italians surrender to the Allies, to the U.S. and British forces, the Allies forces that are coming through there, and Mussolini tries to sneak off. The Germans actually seize the northern part of Italy. They put Mussolini back in charge, but they're only really in charge of this part. The fighting keeps going on, and then Mussolini tries to sneak off. He's actually captured, disguised as a German soldier, and his own people, the Italian people, hang him It's a pretty famous picture of he's hanging from like a clock tower, and some other collaborators, I think even including his girlfriend or something like that, in Milan. So pretty gruesome stuff. But that was how the Italian people felt like they had been sold out by their own country, by their own government anyway. So let's turn our eyes towards the home front for just a second. Um, as the Allies start mobilizing for war, especially in the United States, who we tend to obviously lean on and talk about, the home front changes. Factories start producing wartime supplies. Many men, as we saw in World War One, millions of them join and are drafted into the military, which means that a lot of workers in the factories became women in these war industries. My great grandmother drove a troop truck in Oklahoma at a military base, moving soldiers from one area to another. So you start to see all sorts of things, but you also start to see propaganda. Now, this is some Soviet propaganda here. Obviously, who's in it with you? Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, he's in it. He's right here with you. You guys fighting. He's not. He's back, in Moscow somewhere. But then here's another one. Once again, the symbol of Soviet Russia, the hammer and the sickle, the workers and the farmers, together with the soldiers, all this kind of stuff. So this is propaganda, one-sided messages trying to get you to feel a particular way. And here is some of the American propaganda. This is obviously a Japanese, soldier. It could be Tojo or somebody like that because he's wearing glasses, and that became a pretty common thing. And I'm not protecting it, but there are some racial overtones here as well. But here's, go ahead, please take the day off. If you don't work hard, you're not helping the United States fight the Japanese in the war effort. When you ride in your car by yourself and you're not, carpooling, then you are wasting gasoline that could be used for the war effort. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So they're trying to convince, the American people to support the war effort and put that into action as well. The ramping up wartime capabilities in our factories, men volunteering for the military and being drafted, women taking their places in the factories and things like that. Also changing the way that they ate. They would grow what they called victory gardens and things like that. They would ration things like sugar, gasoline, and rubber and things like that. And also, everything was basically towards being an American hero, doing what you could do. But there was also a dark side to this, and I'm not going to hide from that. And I don't think that Americans do themselves any favors when they do either. Because of, you saw some of the racial overtones of the propaganda. One of the issues that we had to deal with was that we had Japanese Americans. These were American citizens of Japanese ancestry, and they were not trusted by a lot of the local communities. So one of the things that is one of the darkest hours of American history is the United States government built these internment camps. Now, these camps were not like a death camp or something like that. They were simply places that these Japanese families had to come to and live in. Okay, they had to come to and live in. Now, Japanese Americans, some of these folks actually fought for the United States in the military. And you see all sorts of stories like that. But because their local communities and Americans in general were afraid of them and were mistrustful of them, some of it due to the propaganda, they said, we're going to move you to these internment camps for your safety, which that wasn't the case. They wanted to be able to keep an eye on them. So they're limiting an American civil rights because of something like that. So like I said, pretty dark day in American history, but if we own up to it, then and acknowledge it, then the American government has apologized for it at this point, and there's been some money paid out and things like that for restitution. Well, now let's jump back over to Europe. This is how victory in Europe is going to start to be achieved. This is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is the Allied commander in Europe. He's an American general. Him talking to some troops. This is a Higgins boat right here, super famous because this is what carried the troops from the ships to the shore on D-Day. And D-Day is just talking about the day when we invaded. That was the name given to the day that we invaded Europe. we had gone from the UK. You've seen the maps before of 20, 25 miles of the English Channel from England over to France. Well, this is it. And we did a whole bunch of things to make them think we were going to other places. And then we came in with these heavy forces, American forces, British forces, and also Canadian forces under British guide came in as well. And these beaches, these names for these places have become, famous. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, the American ones, Gold, Juno, and Sword. I've actually been to Bayeux, France, and it's a pretty amazing old Norman town. And then been out to the beaches, and it's some pretty impressive stuff. But we come with this huge contingent of forces, and we suffer heavy losses. If you've seen any of the movies that show it, heavy losses, but it's successful. The plan, push into these places, there's Bayou again, push into these places and establish sort of like this objective line of being able to get a toehold and then starting to bring in supplies. We dropped in, there's the 82nd Airborne, behind the enemy lines the night before in order to start doing some damage. The 6th Airborne Division of the British over here, and all sorts of crazy stories about some of the stuff they've done. You watch Band of Brothers, it'll change your life. It's an amazing stuff. And like we said, heavy losses. This is from the cemetery in Normandy. The French, you see here, this is an American and a French flag. The French actually bequeathed or gifted this area to the United States. This is technically American territory, so that these young men could be buried in America, even though this is still technically over in Europe. And there's a pretty amazing museum. You can go down to the beaches and see where they came in, and it is incredibly moving. But we get this toehold in, and we start bringing in forces and stuff, and are able to bring in more of military push, and eventually, that is going to be June 6, 1944. Eventually, we're able to push back into forcing the Germans' hand. They have one last push, is what's called the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes Forest, and we're able to hold them off. Victory in Europe Day comes when the Russians, the Soviets, push in from the east. Allied forces push in from the west. We hold the Germans off, and eventually in April of 45, the Allies take Berlin, and we actually, under a secret agreement, allowed the Soviets to do that. Hitler and his wife commit suicide, and then the Third Reich technically surrenders and things like that. And then we get hit with a crazy 1-2 punch, because FDR then dies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt technically dies. And the country's incredibly sad, but incredibly happy at the same time because of what they called Victory in Europe Day. So quickly back to the Pacific. The Japanese begin to retreat. They're running out of resources as well, and troops. The island hopping thing. There's MacArthur again. The island hopping thing starts to work. This is a famous picture from Iwo Jima. Japanese employed all sorts of stuff to try to stop us, including kamikaze pilots who had bombs on their planes, but instead of trying to drop them, which is a lower percentage, they would actually crash and commit suicide runs and things like that. But then the end comes when President Truman, Harry Truman's now the president, gives the go-ahead for the Manhattan Project, which is nuclear weapons. And the first one is Hiroshima. The Enola Gay captained. It comes in and drops a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. Incredible devastation. The Japanese still are don't want to surrender. So a few days later, we drop another bomb on Nagasaki, and same sort of devastation. And we tell them we've got way more. We didn't. We only had those two. And the Japanese actually surrender, and then that technically is the end of the war. September of 1945, with the Japanese surrender. World War II is over.